Well, we have a terrific panel which flows on beautifully from what we just heard from Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who's laid out the big picture problem and the dangers. We're now going to hear from three people who are on the front lines trying to analyze this on the micro level and, most importantly, chart out ways of trying to fight back. So I'd like to start with you, Professor Woolley from Pittsburgh, talking about what you're doing with computational propaganda. You've been looking a lot at automation and AI and bots and how that's making the disinformation problem worse. Can you tell us briefly what your research has found in terms of the impact of the rise of AI in worsening these problems we just heard about, and above all else, what we can do to fight back?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing we can say is that the landscape has changed, that there's been an understanding that we've had for a number of decades, perhaps even a few generations, about how the media works and how control of the media works, whether it's by authoritarian actors or others. The internet changed the game, and we were slow to cop to it. We began with a period of thinking that it would be the savior of democracy, and now we're in a time where we understand that actually it's been quite quickly normalized for control by powerful political actors, including some of the ones that have been discussed throughout the course of this conference. Automation and AI play critical roles in enhancing propaganda campaigns around the world, enhancing disinformation campaigns around the world. They are the special sauce that makes this stuff new now. If I had $1 for every time I'd heard someone ask me, if I had $1 for every time someone had asked me, propaganda's not new, why do you care so much about this? What I would say is automation and AI, that's the thing. So bots, social media bots have been talked about a lot. They were talked a lot about in 2016, a lot during Brexit. What we have now is the advent of generative AI, a system that can not just drive up the amount of content that appears on a social media channel, you know, from the tens to the thousands, if we're talking about human versus automated capacity. But now we're talking about the sophistication of that content, the ability to change not just from clunky messages that are repeated by bots that might be disinformative or harassing or some such, but also for the capacity to make those messages micro-targeted, highly persuasive, and also quite effective at getting people to engage in apathy when it comes to engaging in politics. So across the board, we see a lot of effectiveness. In terms of what we can do to fight back, look, when Mark Zuckerberg went before Congress in 2018, he was right in saying that AI was the solution to the problems that we now face in many ways. But it was something of a MacGuffin for Zuckerberg. He wanted it to be everything. AI will not be everything in combating the problems that we now face, because they're fundamentally also human problems first and technological problems second. And so there's got to be people involved in the responses to these kinds of campaigns. Given what Lieutenant Colonel Vindman just said about the lack of movement in the US government for the next 3 years, given social media companies' retreat away from content moderation and towards this kind of disingenuous agnosticism about what's happening in their spaces, I think that, as Lieutenant Colonel Vindman said, communities have to be part of the solution. And it makes me quite angry, because I think we're putting the problem back upon people that have limited capacity, that are already dealing with so much. But my current project at University of Pittsburgh, my new project, is shifting away from what Lieutenant Colonel Vindman correctly said is sort of describing the problem or diagnosing the problem, and towards solutions. So I think some of my fellow panelists will talk about this in greater detail, but community-driven responses to disinformation are the most exciting space that I can see right now. We see it amongst marginalized communities. We see it amongst groups that should not have to be doing this, but that are, and are doing fantastic work. And so that's my next dearest hope.
Right. Before I turn to the other panelists, I'm curious about this issue of using AI both for really bad purposes, but also potentially for good as well. Because Audrey Tang, the former digital minister of Taiwan, was in Cambridge. In fact, she stayed with me for a couple of weeks here in King's. And she is very cognizant of the dangers of bots, but also a strong believer that you can design tools and platforms with AI that help to mitigate some of the worst aspects of polarization and spot disinformation, that they can also be used for good, even on a community level. Would you agree? It's not just Mark Zuckerberg saying that.
Yeah, I agree, but in a measured way. I think that technologists want to give you technological solutions, and social scientists maybe want to give you social solutions. I'm a social scientist, so that's a caveat. But what I will say is that AI really, in my experience with it, as an effective mechanism for responding to disinformation and propaganda, is only so useful as the people not only that train it, but that maintain it and use it and continue to use it. And so, yes, AI can play a critical role, but if we launch AI in the way that we launch social media, absent any guardrails, and I know that Audrey Tang is not saying that, Audrey Tang's a very great thinker in this space, many others, including in the United States, where much of the AI innovation is going on in the West, do not want guardrails, and without those guardrails to mitigate misuse, the problem could end up magnifying itself.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, I'd like to bring Alex in at this point because a lot of people see what's happening in terms of political battles, but your work suggests that as part of those political battles, bad actors are also leveraging very personal issues around gender and identity, and in particular, the rise of the so-called manosphere, online, all of the bros, all of the aggressive incel culture that we see on 4chan and 8chan and things like that is feeding into this very, very ugly ecosystem. Can you tell us a bit about what you've found in your research around this? And are we still underestimating the degree to which this is actually feeding into these dangers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I appreciate Sam talking about that technology is an enhancement and it deals with human problems, because my work looks particularly over the last 50 years of the development of supremacist movements, especially in the United States. And so I think that when you look at that, you see a continuity in the kind of ideology and framing, and you see spaces such as education and entertainment media as continuing to be very significant. And so in addition to online organizing and the creation of videos and media there, you also still have attacks on groups like Drag Story Hour, you have attacks on the early education and K-12 curricula, and these are spaces where young people and children learn to humanize others and to value compassion and consent or not. And so we've looked at things like the institution that I work with has a number of fellows, and one of them is focused on English literature. And so she did a piece years ago looking at how the standard US literary canon reflects a lot of the ideas that you would see in misogynist incel forums. That you are reading books that are very focused on young cisgender boys, in which girls exist only sort of through their lens, they're not humanized. There's entitlement, there's issues with consent. Catcher in the Rye is one of the books that she looked at around that. And so what we see going on in these online movements is they are picking up and enhancing and making more radical or extreme what we already have in our culture, but they are building off of the long-standing white male supremacism that is active in the United States, that patriarchy and male supremacism are global issues, and so the interventions need to be things that consider not just online as something that is completely different than anything we've seen before, but a really powerful tool for spreading the ideas that have been around and workshopped for decades, and recognizing things like when we look at today's anti-trans rhetoric, it's basically picking up the anti-gay rhetoric of the 80s and 90s. They're not creating new talking points. And the online organizers, the Andrew Tates, et cetera, while they are innovating some ideas, much of what they are doing is drawing off of pre-existing ideas that were A/B tested in think tanks and direct mail and things like that. And so it's not actually coming out of nowhere, and we can look at that in our organizing where we think about there are multiple levels where we need to be thinking about prevention.
So how do you combat that in a world where anybody who's trying to push back on that incel bro culture is now labeled as woke and therefore dismissed? I mean, how do you fight, how do you have a backlash against a backlash?
So just before I founded the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, I gave an interview to NPR, ironically, about the emotional toll of doing research on extremism. And a neo-Nazi site really did not like one of my quotes, and so they put up my picture and wrote about me very disparagingly, which I saw at my good friend's bachelorette party. So that was my sort of entry into about a week before we founded the organization. And so I think, we saw the earlier panel, like harassment, backlash, that these are all certainly significant parts of the environment. We're simultaneously running right now our virtual conference on male supremacism studies, and we'll be having a session on digital security, which we always do. So there are ways for people to protect themselves, but there's also, I think, sometimes too much concern with the idea of backlash, because the truth is, even if we don't do anything, supremacists and authoritarians will still come up with reasons to claim that what we're doing is deeply outrageous. And I often see what they accuse us of and say, it's a really good blueprint for what we should actually be doing, and I wish that we were. And so I think that often, even though that might be the dialogue and those accusations might happen, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that stops us from continuing to organize. And I think this is also where you bring in the idea of, community and mass kind of organizing, that we need voices on the side of social justice as well, who are going to speak up in support of, of justice, of people who stand up, of people who resist, of institutions that resist, and not, worry about being drowned out, not let the censorship on the other side work, but be really committed to this. And it's why I think building alliances. Also, I mentioned Drag Story Hour. I know that Sage and Jester sponsored the reception here. There are a number of groups working on art and culture, and those are, I think, really key parts as well of bringing people together and having a resistance that is fueled by joy and creativity to sustain us through the potential burnout, and to be voices that are able to join together.
Right. Well, thank you. That's very good advice. I mean, the emotional toll can be very, very high. It's bad enough for women in the West. My blood boils when I look at what's happened to some female activists in the Middle East, and the way that, AI has been used to create fake porn in a way that's designed to shame them and silence them. And the cost of this for so many people is high, and the bravery that people are displaying by trying to fight back is very, very laudable. But in terms of the fight back, I mean, you've spent some time, Ashley, trying to work out why some unions and civic groups in authoritarian states go out and resist autocracy and others don't. You've been looking at different countries in the Middle East and elsewhere, North Africa and elsewhere, to understand, what is the different path between those that are willing to fight back and display that courage and those which don't. Can you tell us what decides how and when people fight, and what are some of the most effective tactics that they can use? Because we all need guidance right now, and a sense of cheer.
Yes. So can I tell you why people fight? I probably can't answer that, right? It's kind of up to each individual person and when they feel they've had too much. But I can tell you when I suspect movements are going to be effective at fighting, right? And I think that's mostly about being strategic, being disciplined, and being innovative. So there are organizations that really focus, they have a long-term plan, right? They understand who their targets are and what their targets plan is. They understand who their audience is, and they understand what their goals are and are very good at communicating those to different actors within the movement. So that's one element, I think, that if we're going to form a resistance, we really need to be more strategic about it. And I think many times when we see an onslaught, which is what certain authoritarians like to do, they'd like to have this like fire hose of falsehoods and things like this thrown at us. We're just like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. I feel stuck. Don't feel stuck. There are all sorts of ways that people move around repression, even very fierce repression. An example I really like is solidarity in Poland, right? The Polish government was banned presses, and so then, or rather, the Polish government had a lot of propaganda, so Solidarity created their own printing press. Then the Polish government banned printing presses, and so what they did is they used onion skins, right? And typed, subversive press on onion skins. And the government couldn't ban onions, right? Or if they did, they would look completely absurd in doing so. And so those types of yes, there's a repressive government in front of you, there are obstacles, but we can shift around those and be very creative in the ways that we get our messages out.
Right, so strategic, just be strategic, be disciplined and innovative. Mm-hmm. Being a shallow journalist, I turn it around and say, if you say strategic, innovative, and disciplined, you end up with the acronym SID, which is very easy to remember. So we should all remember SID, if you like. Yes. But, I was talking recently to people in America, and someone very wise, one of my mentors, suggested that when you're looking at resistance, rather than people sitting there frozen saying, what shall I do, everybody should work out what their own unique skill set is, their own USP, and focus on that above all else in America today. Would you agree in terms of everyone trying to find their own skill set and focus ruthlessly on that?
To a certain extent, yes. And this is where I think the plan is very necessary to have and to communicate to people, because I think it's best if we have an overarching plan, you can figure out where you fit in that, right? Not everybody has to do the same thing, but everybody has to be working in service of the same goal, doing what they do best in that goal, right? And so I think movements operate best when you have people of different skill sets all working towards the same end. I also think that kind of obviates problems that we have where we're like, oh, well, why aren't black people out protesting right now? Like, they should be the most mad about this. Well, maybe right now they're resting up so that they're, ready for the next thing. Or maybe they're planning something that isn't very front-facing right now because it would actually be a harm to the movement to be front-facing because that might invite repression, whatever. But they'll come in when they're strategically most necessary, right? But right now what I think we have is not a good sense of what the goal is, like where it is that we plan to end up and what the steps are to do that. And so it's hard for people to quite find their niche and make sure that they're not working at cross purposes.
But all of you must be dealing with this fire hose problem. Because one of the biggest problems, as a journalist is simply the sheer amount of information is so overwhelming. It's part of the deliberate flooding the zone strategy that people like Steve Bannon are pushing for, that it's almost impossible to know even where to start. You must feel that with the range of, incel, toxic masculinity information that's coming down.
So I think this is one of the reasons, to focus on your own thing, but also work together. So we have about 70 odd fellows and mentees at the Institute now who are based all around the globe, including places, non-Western countries like Malaysia, who are bringing in different kinds of insights. We're looking to do a webinar sometime over the summer about South Korea and the example there in which they had an authoritarian leader who they were able to remove, and he was very much characterized by male supremacism, and the resistance was very much led by women. And so I'm very interested in hearing from a regional expert what is going on in that circumstance. And so I think that there's, when you have a large group of people who they are coming together through our network, but they all have their emphases. And I think also, if we're looking sort of in the historical view, yes, there's a lot, this kind of flooding the zone, but Project 2025 was, out for a year before Trump was elected. And it's very similar to Mandate for Leadership from Reagan in the 80s and Heritage Foundation work through the years. The other executive orders are taken from places like the Independent Women's Forum, their work on biological essentialism. And so I think actually one of the reasons that we've been behind on responding is because there's a little bit of a putting the head in the sand kind of thing, like, oh, well, he's not going to get elected on this, so we don't need to prepare. And there are organizations who are preparing, especially those who represent the most vulnerable and the most marginalized, people of color, immigrants, trans people, but those are the ones that are too small and too strapped to do everything themselves. And so we really need to support those kinds of organizations and work with them and recognize that, like, this is decades of building, and we need the same kind of infrastructure to respond to it so that it doesn't feel as overwhelming, because they did all the work to actually create all of these ideas and policies and proposals, and we can on the other side both respond to theirs, and also I like the idea of kind of disproportionate response, that anytime they try to ban something, anytime they put forward a problematic policy, you don't only aim to stop it, you also aim to do something that goes one better. If they wanted to ban the book, don't just keep them from banning it at your local library, organize an event around it, because we know that there are some places where we're going to lose, and so if the focus is only on holding the line, we're overall losing ground. And so that is part of also not just being reactive, being proactive in our work as well.
Right. I mean, that brings me to a question I wanted to ask Samuel, and I will turn to the audience for questions in just a moment. But, you're analyzing the spread of misinformation online and how AI tools and bots are worsening that. Do you think it's time for people who want to combat that to not simply try and prevent it, but to fight back?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that it's time to fight back, and the time it's been the time for quite a while. I think that the problem is that our knee-jerk reaction, or at least what I've seen in conference rooms and in conferences and things like this, is a desire to fight fire with fire. To say, we see all of this AI-driven propaganda, or we see automated propaganda, or the like. So let's do the same thing. And I think oftentimes when you think in those terms technologically, you end up missing the boat. I think that, and again, this is couched within the fact that I am a social scientist, and that's my leaning. I think that if we take up in our proactivity and our reactivity, if we take up more sort of a socially focused method of responding, that will be more successful. So the right in the United States, the Manosphere, many other groups cut from this cloth, they are really, really good at relational influence. They're very good at making it seem as if they're just like us, just like one of the people. The thing you hear people in the United States say about Trump to this day, I grew up in Colorado, my friends there, what they say is, he might be a liar, but at least he's authentic. And influencers, which seems baffling to me, influencers are on the rise, obviously. Paid political influencers are on the rise. One of the things my team has been doing, both at UT Austin, where I was just before joining Pitt, and now at Pittsburgh, has been doing is tracking the way that paid political influencers are being coordinated, absent any kind of disclosure, in the United States and across the globe, to push messaging. The reason why this is successful isn't because of some fancy AI analysis that's been done. It's because you have Cuban American influencers in Miami talking to their group. You have women in Ukraine talking to Ukrainians. You have so on and so forth. You can imagine what the potential is for this. It can be used, however, for very good causes as well. The United Nations leveraged this exact same tool. Influencers paid small amounts of money that were from Johannesburg or that were from St. Petersburg to spread messaging on vaccination. And when it comes from someone you care about, you actually are much more likely to do something. And so yes, we should absolutely be fighting back, but we need to be creative in the way that we do this. I really liked what Lieutenant Colonel Vindman said about being punchy in our response too. And I'm hearing that from my colleagues on stage. I think that now is the time to absolutely speak out and step up, and I hope that everyone will take heart.
Well, we've got time now for some questions from the audience. I know that lots of people were wanting to ask questions before, so I think we should create plenty of time for that. So if you'd like to ask questions, please indicate who you are briefly. That'd be courteous. Keep your questions short so we can get as much of a discussion and debate as possible.
Is there any way we can incentivize mostly tech corporations to actually, frankly, give a damn about regulating this, either financially or legally? Because I don't think they really care.
Alex?
Yeah, so...
Do we have any representatives from tech companies here, by the way?
We do. They want to self-reveal.
They're feeling a bit shy.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, if anyone would like to step in and comment on this, do let me know. But Alex.
Yeah, so in one of my earliest jobs, I worked on women's rights organizing, and we worked on these kind of pro-rape pages on Facebook, and there was very little interest on Facebook's part in taking them down, and they sort of said that, well, they're jokes and things like that. They did eventually, after a lot of organizing, get them to take these down, but it was very resistant. And I think what I would say about kind of technology companies is some platforms are better than others in terms of whether they care or not. Facebook traditionally does not care at all. TikTok actually had hired somebody from the Southern Poverty Law Center to work on hate speech and trying to understand it. And so I don't know about on kind of the legal side, incentivization, but on the kind of social side and what we invest in, like there are technology platforms that are run by people who actually care and those who don't. And I think that we can see with Musk's takeover of Twitter, that he has now called X, and people moving off that platform and onto Blue Sky, that people actually have the power to make or break a platform. And the fact that we've been willing to invest in something in which all of our online social platforms are run by corporations, and that none of them are even B corporations or nonprofit or organized for the social good, that is not their mission, is fundamentally one of the biggest problems and a really important area, I think, for innovation.
Yeah, Ashley.
And can I also say, I think many times we are pursuing institutional solutions when the institutional actors have no interest in doing it. My question is not how do we get Facebook to do a thing, but rather how do we get people not to really seek out this content in the first place, right? So many times I feel like young boys go to the manosphere because they are looking for examples of masculinity, right? They want to know how should I be a man in this world in a way that will be acceptable, that will be, good. And I think we can do that through organizations, right? There are organizations that you see in communities where it's like dads who walk their kids to school, who actively try to mentor young men and give them different views of masculinity. I think the problem is not how to get a corporation whose incentive is profit to do something that might not be profitable, but how to get a young boy who's actually searching for basically a community, a different type of community to go to, right? That's where I, as an organizer, that's where I would focus my efforts, is how do we build up these alternative places where they can get information to keep them off of Twitter in the first place, right? And maybe shuffle them, so that they're more likely to go to bluer skies and to their community mentors to figure out the answers to the questions that they seek.
Right. We've got another question there.
Sure.
Hi.
Hello. Sohan D'Souza, Max Planck Institute for Human Development. In the past year and a half, across my investigations, I've seen a lot of misinformation, like influence operations being directed at Western countries from outside, from like East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. And these are either people who are like content farms that are paid to push influence operations on someone's behalf, or people just because of the purchasing power parity, like the little bit of money that they get from running the most outrage bait-filled pages, mostly right-wing outrage bait, gets, can sustain a comfortable lifestyle for them. So just in terms of like the monetization transparency, both for people paying to push inorganic content or people monetizing, grifts basically, what can be done from like a regulation perspective, perhaps, to compel like transparency and exposing these people and hopefully getting these countries to do something about them?
Samuel, is this a place where your computational work can help?
Sure, yeah. So I've written about some of this in various countries, and I think that if you ever needed a reason that experts in business and accounting should be involved in this problem, here's the reason, right? Like, this is a business. There is a murky underside to most of the activities that we're talking about that is run by intermediary groups that exist across the world. It's a challenging situation because many of these PR firms, if they want to call themselves that, we've come up with a better thing to call them, troll farms, of course, but that doesn't always get it, that they are international. And so you've put your finger on it, which is like, how do we hold them accountable? Well, one of the things we can do is disincentivize in terms of the market incentives that exist for them to do this kind of work. But that requires buy-in by governments. It requires buy-in by the social media companies to do that. It also requires holding them to account for what they're doing. And so where open source intelligence and forensic research can be really beneficial is, the Bellingcats of the world, where they're amazing, is actually saying, these are the groups that are actually doing this kind of stuff. One of the inspirations for me in this space, and again, I'm both American and British, so I'll use a U.S. example in this situation, is the U.S. Attorney General's office in the state, the New York Attorney General's office in the state of New York has done actually some litigation trying to go after some of the PR firms that are engaging in the kinds of things that we're talking about using what I like to call the Al Capone method, right? Like, we know that they're using disinformation to target people, and we know that that's a big problem, but we know that the response, if we go after them for disinformation, is going to be, that's censorship, that's anti-free speech, da-da-da-da-da, even though it might be defamation and the like. So instead, you go after them for financial crimes. You go after them for other types of crimes, because oftentimes these kinds of groups aren't just trafficking in disinformation. They're trafficking in a lot of other really bad stuff. And so we've got to broaden our horizons in the way that we go after them.
Yeah, there's also a lot of very interesting work being done to try and look at advertising as well, and all the fake advertising bots. Yeah.
So my name's Penny Roach, and I'm talking to you as a safeguarding lead, which is a UK terminology which might not translate to an international stage, but we are trained, like I work in a school, and I have a responsibility outside of that school, almost to a government level, to keep our students safe. We're trained in incels, we're trained in white supremacy. I know that that's the greatest risk at the moment in Cambridgeshire, for example, and we're kept up to date with that. I'm trained in the manosphere, and if any student gives any indication of being interested in that, then we would be really concerned about that. We would think about radicalization, and we have our prevent strategy at a government level. So it's really interesting to me listening to what you're talking about, because it sort of, I'm finding a disconnect between the narrative of where it feels like it's a resistance sort of idea for me, whereas for me it's like a kind of governmental mandated idea that we would have some sort of responsibility for that. So my question is you know, we're looking at this idea where the US leads, the UK follows. Is that at risk? Is this space that we have created here something that, you know, we need to consider about how we safeguard that space?
So I'm not deeply familiar with the UK model, although our board chair, Lisa Segura, is based out of the UK and so does a lot of work in this area, so I know a little bit about it. What I would say is that my understanding of most of these kinds of programs are meant to deal with kind of at-risk individuals when something comes up. It's not a fundamental investment deeply in making sure our educational system is one that is really focused on humanization, on critical thinking, which, as discussed yesterday, is the best way to prevent people from falling for disinformation, is not to tell them the true thing, it's to teach them how to think critically. And so we look at all sorts of different elements of curricula. We look at areas like consent-based comprehensive sex education as a really valuable area. We look at the kinds of books that people read. And so these kinds of like prevention programming forged around like identifying risks or signs of white or male supremacism, those are in some ways already 11th hour solutions, that they're not as proactive and they're not deeply invested in. This is, you know, looking at the aspects of how people are educated and what they grow into. And so there's a limitation in how those kinds of programs and toolkits work. And I think that one of the kind of most important things for the preventing and countering extremism and related fields to do is to start thinking about these deep, comprehensive educational and cultural change aspects, not ones that are as focused on like vulnerable youth or red flags or things like that, but preventing it from getting to that stage in the first place.
Systemic action, yeah. Any more questions? We got about another 10 minutes.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Yasmin, I'm the founder of Free Free. Free Free is an organization that works for the freedom, physical, emotional, and financial freedom more specifically for women and girls. So we have been working with the Department of Justice and Secretary of Security in Brazil for over 7 years. So we work with violence against women and femicide survivors, train police workers, commanders, all of that. And when, while I was hearing all of this, we also work with schools and universities. One of the things that we've noticed is the cycle, of course, of abuse that has always a perpetrator, the savior and the victim, and how we can break that so that people can actually understand themselves beyond that. And one of the things while I was listening to all of you is what is behind people joining these extreme groups. So one of the things that we've been noticing, of course, is the belonging, the theory of belonging, but also because of the trauma that is behind all of that, and the need for being seen and the need for being heard. So throughout our work, one of the things that we've been trying to do is help people think creatively, building spaces that they can literally think outside of the box, be very creative, joyful, as you were saying, as a solution for extremism. And instead of just, of course, we do work with governments and public entities, but also going directly to the public in a more decentralized way, creating spaces that people, men, women, anyone, can really feel seen, so that they can kind of get out of what we call this golden cage that they're in, trying to fit into a myth that was created by the media, and then they would have the self-worth to break the cycle of this, everything we've been discussing. So I just wanted to just share this with all of you and hear your thoughts and how you see this scaling, in ways that at the moment, since we can't trust social media, because social media is, of course, being manipulated, and then we have critical thinking, one of the ways that we have been exploring is decentralizing all of this so that people can, have these conversations in safe places, and then they don't need to go through extreme groups to find their place.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Samuel?
I do. What I'll say is that the solutions to the problem have to take into consideration belonging and empathy. If you want to put it in the language of people who study terrorism, they have to take into consideration the push and the pull factors that bring people into these kinds of groups. I have a colleague, former collaborator, Britton Heller, who likes to quote The Art of War, and often she says, we must build a golden bridge over which our enemies can retreat, which is from that text. And I think it's apt because while it's very difficult to engage with these kinds of groups, I think that absent understanding, absent empathy, absent community-driven responses to the problems that we're talking about, what are we left with? We talk a lot about the efficacy of fact-checking, we talk about inoculation, we talk about pre-bunking and debunking, we talk about all these things. But a lot of times, the reason why, if I can cut to the quick for a minute, that they don't succeed is that they lack any kind of emotion, they lack any kind of respect, and they often come from the top down. You're trying to talk to people who have already bought into these kinds of ideas. You're trying to talk to people who are true believers oftentimes. And because of that, you have to come up with other mechanisms for reaching out to them. And, media literacy is an excellent way of combating this, but that's a long-term solution. In the short term, in the medium term, we're going to have to come up with some other solutions. And if we don't do that quickly, we're going to be in a lot of trouble, and England will be in a lot of trouble.
Hi, I'm Rafi, and I work for a company called Cyabra. We're a tech company that detects and uncovers disinformation across social media. Firstly, a shameless plug for the panel session tomorrow after lunch in the debate hall, where we're going to be talking about the evolving tech ecosystem and continuing much of the conversation here. During this fascinating discussion, there's been two axes of the frameworks. There's been truth versus lies, and wrapped within that are important topics of fact-checking and the way that we behave and general conduct and harassment. And there's another axis of real versus fake, where we're going online, we've all accepted, because we're here, that there's a lack of trust, but we don't even know the people that we're speaking to if they are real or fake. In terms of finding solutions or the frameworks of solutions, do you think the lack of clarity or confusion around or articulating that framework of what the axes are and what the challenges are creates more confusion in terms of discussing the possible solutions? Because there's so many different solutions wrapped up in this, but the different solutions address different aspects of this conversation. And often they merge within each other and, even worse, confuse each other and distract us from discussing and focusing on the things that need to be addressed.
It's certainly the case.
Samuel.
It's certainly the case that real or fake muddy the waters. When you look at science that we've been presented in the last couple of days, a lot of times you're looking at data that's coming from social media. How do you know that the data that you're getting from social media is quality? How do you know that it's not riddled with comments from bots, from coordination, those kinds of things? It's a really important question to ask that I don't think even academics have begun to really contend with. I think that, as we've all talked about, the solution lies in some form of community-driven action, and it's not just a cop-out. It's to say that, like Saul Alinsky used to say, you go to people and talk to them about what they care about, and then you scale the effort. Then you scale the methods. And so, yes, we do need to know who's real or fake, and that has to be incorporated into our responses on social media in particular, because oftentimes we're trying to put out fires that might not exist in those kinds of situations. People like Joan Donovan, Renee DiResta, Kate Starbird have talked about this a lot. Like, don't let yourself be manipulated into responding in a situation you shouldn't. But at the same time, there's a very human level part of this that I think that we've talked a lot about here, and that I'm really heartened to hear. So I'll end with that.
Right. Well, I think we are sadly.
Oh, he wants to do one.
One more question in? Okay, very
It's just-
quickly.
I'll happy to close the session. I was just wondering. In fact, as part of the conference is the sort of debate as as scientists, we observe, we gather data, we do research. We don't have agendas. We try to do unbiased work. But then there's also the attacks on scientific institutions, right? There's as Alan mentioned in his opening speech, you can resist unfair criticism that is not evidence-based. But some people might look at some elements of, of what is talked about and say, well, that's social action. It's a social action agenda rather than a scientific agenda. But, if you look at public demand for science, it's changing, right? Some members of the public want scientists to be more involved, be more active advocates for policy. But should scientists be advocates? Should scientists engage in action? What do you think, what could resistance look like in a way that remains scientific for, in terms of when we're talking about science?
I think cross-sectoral collaboration is important, right? Scientists should do what scientists do, and social movements should do what they do, but they should work together. I think one of the things that we forget about organizations is that is a hub of learning, of socialization, and of skill development. And so if we have cross-sectoral collaborations where scientists are, let's say, hosting a symposium in, a union about best collective bargaining strategies, right? Or how to realize when you're being manipulated online in favor of employers, or how people try to disrupt union organizing through social media strategies. That's where I think we can work together and still shield scientists from the idea that they're trying to embed themselves in an agenda or direct politics in a certain way. No, you're doing the work that you do, but we see value in the work that you do as movement organizers, and we're calling you to help us do what we do better.
It's worth pointing out, by the way, that after Trump was elected the first time, scientists realized that there were more talk show radio hosts in Congress than people with a science background. And they went out and created, for the first time in history, a PAC to protect science called 314action.org. I don't know if any of you know about it, but it's worth looking at it because behind the scenes it's actually been quite effective in getting people into positions of authority or elected positions. They asked for 1,000 volunteers initially, they got 7,000 immediately. So if you're looking for examples of potential resistance and how to actually coordinate, that's one. I think we are now out of time. I'll simply say three things. I take three things away from this conversation. One, misinformation is very bad and getting much worse, and no one should ignore that. Two, civil society in the West has been woefully naive about this. I say that with feeling, and in many ways shamefully naive, and very slow to react and respond. But three, now, thank heavens, the urgency of the situation is finally waking people up. It reminds me a bit like of the frog in the boiling water story. We've been that frog in the pot being very, very, very slowly heated up in the last 2 decades. If there's any silver lining to the horrific cloud we now sit under, it's that we've been dropped into the boiling water with a dramatic sense of shock. And let's just hope that that shock inspires us all to wake up and get active in trying to fight back.